Hey, welcome to Tabletop Skirmish Games and the first episode in the new TTSG Solocast. I'm Lee, and in this Solocast I'll be taking you through all aspects of tabletop skirmish game design, and we'll be talking about different areas within skirmish gaming. Since I started the channel 3 years ago, I've been spending a lot of time looking at different tabletop skirmish games, breaking down rules, making how to play series, and in that time I've learned a lot about what it takes to make a good game. 2 years ago I launched my own game, Weekend Warriors, and since then I've been working on a number of different games and specifically on solo and AI mechanics. I've got another game coming out in January 2024 called Population Z. Welcome to Huntsville. It's a zombie survival game which you can play as solo or co-op. And so recently I've been focusing on that a lot, and I finally managed to get my solo and AI mechanics down. I'm really happy with the result. Before I started the channel, I was working as a freelance writer. I've published a number of books, worked as a ghostwriter as well, and so it's really fun now to be able to take that and apply it to the world of tabletop skirmish gaming. And this is the direction I'll be going in now for the future. After Population Z, I've got a number of other games lined up. The past couple of years, I've written lots of different games, but never actually got around to publish them, because I was stuck on the solo and AI mechanics. But now I've got it fixed, I can apply that to all the different games now, and that system will translate for all different genres. So it's really exciting, and I can't wait for the next few years ahead. Now I'm at this stage, I thought it would be fun to start a solo podcast where I talk about how to write a tabletop skirmish game. So if you're interested in this area and you'd like to write your own game, hopefully this podcast will be helpful and you'll get some inspiration and information to help you get your game from an idea to a published book. Let's get started then, and in today's episode 1 of the new Solocast, we're going to be talking about defining core game mechanics. At the heart of tabletop skirmish game design lies a crucial element that shapes the entire gaming experience, and these are the core mechanics. In this podcast, we're going to discuss the importance of defining core mechanics specifically in a tabletop skirmish game. We'll go through 5 main elements that work together to create an enjoyable gaming experience for our players. Typically, tabletop skirmish games are fast-paced. Now, they don't have to be, and with games like Population Z, I'm going to be slowing things down a little bit and introducing more rounds, so there's unlimited rounds. There are going to be mechanics in place that kind of bring the game to a natural end, but regardless of whether they're fast-paced or not, they are going to have a strategic element to them, and this strategic element demands a solid foundation, which comes in the form of well-defined core mechanics. These core mechanics act as the backbone of the game, and they're going to dictate how players interact with the game scenarios, NPCs if they're in play, and they're going to also influence how they make decisions. So by establishing clear and concise rules for things like movement, combat resolution, abilities, resource management, and interaction with the environment, we game creators can set the stage for a challenging and immersive experience. And that's what it's all about. We're going to create a world, a narrative within that world, and then players are going to take the characters and act out scenarios, and they're going to take the game and the story in directions of their own. It's got to be challenging along the way, but the key is that they immerse themselves in the world that you've created, and to do that, we need a solid set of core mechanics. I've broken down 5 main elements of core mechanics, so we're going to look at movement, combat resolution, abilities, resource management, and interaction with the environment. So let's start with the first one, movement. How our characters traverse the battlefield significantly influences the overall strategy. When we define movement mechanics, they're not only going to impact tactical decisions that our players are going to make, but they're also going to contribute to the flow of the game. From things like line of sight and cover systems, right across to how models will navigate obstacles, maybe tricky terrain. But overall, a well thought out movement system is going to enhance the depth of the gaming experience. How we define movement has a big impact on the gameplay. For example, in games like Necromunda, you're going to be moving in inches. I'm not going to go down the kill team shapes route just now. We'll get to that later. We're going to focus on Necromunda and the inches. So with inches, you've got a precise, well-defined movement, and you can use that to interact with your gaming environment. But in contrast, games like Zombicide use zones, so they're making movement more regimented and predictable, but not as precise. While the Zombicide use of zones is easier to move your models around the battlefield, it's not as precise, and it doesn't feel as immersive for me. I don't feel like the models are going to be really getting stuck in and fighting with each other. Having the movement where you have to get within an inch, for example, really puts those models close together and you feel like you're actually engaging in battle with them. I guess this is one of those places where a board game and a skirmish game are quite close together, or can be, but very far apart also. So that movement makes a massive difference. So how you define it in your core mechanics is going to have a big influence on how the game is played and how it's received by the players. Let's talk about combat resolution now. So in tabletop skirmish games, a lot of the thrill of the game comes from the combat encounters, and core mechanics should provide us with a clear and balanced combat resolution system. That can be a dice-based combat system, like we see in many games, like, again, Necromunda, Kill Team, and Population Z, or it could be a card-driven mechanism, like we see in games like Moonstone. And if you haven't heard of Moonstone before, they use a bluffing mechanic with cards, so it's really interesting, very engaging, and you really feel the social side of the game and coming through from that. Very fun. But the goal, no matter which combat resolution system you have, the goal is to make sure it feels impactful, and it must reward strategic planning. Playing around with the combat resolution system can totally change how your game flows. For example, if you create a combat resolution system that gives a greater chance of causing damage in close combat, this is going to nudge players to try to close down the enemy and perhaps be more aggressive with their movement. If you go in the other direction and look to try and make ranged attacks more powerful, then cover is going to become very important. And then you've got to balance the benefits that cover will give you against the benefits that come from having a certain weapon or an ability that buffs that weapon. So there's all these things to take into account. So it's not one thing in isolation. The combat resolution system is going to influence the movement and vice versa. And it's also going to influence the weapons and abilities and pretty much every other part of the game. I mentioned abilities there, and that's the third main element of core mechanics, so let's look at that now. Unique abilities are going to add a layer of complexity to your tabletop skirmish game. They're going to allow players to differentiate their characters, combine tactics, and develop diverse strategies. Often strategies you didn't have planned as a game designer, and that's the beauty of tabletop skirmish game design. You can create a system that you put out to your players, and then they make all these awesome discoveries. But first, we have to define the mechanics behind our abilities, and this requires a delicate balance to prevent any one ability from dominating the gameplay, while also ensuring that each contributes meaningfully to the overall experience. Abilities go a long way to help progress and deepen the narrative. If you take the backstories of your characters and then create interesting abilities that make sense to that backstory and also call back to things that they've done or experienced, that's really awesome. That makes a really fun and deep connection between an ability, which could just be a simple buff to a particular weapon, and the character you've chosen to give it to. You'll find that the abilities, when given to different characters, are going to influence other characters too. So this is going to help to bond different characters together. So as one character might have an ability that works really well with another character and their ability. So you're going to get a buff to your group or warband as a whole. So that's really interesting. When all these little things start emerging from the core mechanics, it's great fun. Let's have a look at the fourth element of core mechanics, and this is resource management. Tabletop skirmish games often involve the careful allocation and management of resources, be it ammunition, energy, weapons, or special abilities. Your core mechanics are going to govern resource management and should strike a balance between scarcity and abundance, and this is going to help to create tension and give meaningful choices to your players. You'll find I talk about meaningful choices quite a lot in these first 10 episodes, and it's a big deal. You really want your players to have player agency. The choices they make and the potential outcomes have to mean something. They have to have an impact on the game and the characters within that game. And the higher stakes, the more meaningful those choices will become. Again, this is all about balance, but it can be achieved through careful scenario planning and working with dice probability to ensure there's a good sense of both risk and reward. The first game where I saw this really working well, and it's a great example, it's Core Space. And in Core Space, searching is a really important part of the game. But as the threat level increases, the risk of using your limited actions to search is going to leave your characters vulnerable to attacks. So you have to weigh up when to search, how often to search, and when to use your actions instead to get out of danger. Now we're on to the fifth element, and that is the interaction with the environment. This is where your terrain is really going to come into play now. A dynamic and interactive environment enhances the immersion of the game, and core mechanics have got to allow players to engage with the environment strategically, whether that's using cover, leveraging elevation perhaps, or even interacting with like scatter objects and NPCs. However you do it, the environment should be more than just a backdrop or collection of terrain. In Population Z, I've made NPCs a huge part of the environment, and they're going to help to bring it to life by posing problems for players to solve, or sometimes helping them achieve their objectives. Players are going to be forced to make some moral dilemmas, whether they accept the help of the NPC, let them keep on hindering them, or they take action and take them out, and that'll have consequences in the aftermath of each scenario. These then build in to that player agency we talked about. There's going to be meaningful decisions to make, but it's all based on the environment and how the characters interact with it. So I like to think of environment as more than terrain. It's more than the battlefield itself. It could be things like weather effects. So you can imagine it's not just what you see on the table that's going on. There's things you don't see, and you have to use your imagination along with the core mechanics to manifest actual effects on the tabletop. So weather is a perfect example of that. There might also be traps and other potential threats that are going to both add to excitement and make the battlefield as important as the miniatures. Now we've looked at 5 main elements of core mechanics. Let's just briefly talk about the importance of clarity, intuitiveness, and balance. Let's start with clarity, and clear and concise core mechanics are so important. I've done a whole separate blog post and episode of the Solocast on clear and concise rule writing. So if you want to check that out, that's going to be available very soon. But it could be the most important thing to strive for when creating a tabletop skirmish game. Ambiguity within the core mechanics can lead to frustration, and it's going to hinder the fluidity of gameplay. When players understand how each element works, they can focus on devising and executing strategic plans, and that's all going to help to elevate their experience. There's nothing worse than having to go back and forth to a book to clarify wordy rules that aren't clear in their meaning. They're going to leave room for opposing interpretations, and they're often going to spoil what could be a potentially good interaction. Now we're on to intuitiveness, and tabletop skirmish games thrive on quick decision making. So intuitive core mechanics are going to enable players to grasp rules swiftly, and that's going to help to reduce the learning curve. An intuitive system ensures that players can concentrate on their characters and those character abilities, rather than grappling with complex rules and again going back and forth to the book where there could be potential conflict between the two players and their interpretation of the rules. I did say I'd bring Kill Team into this at some point, and here we go. We definitely saw how unintuitive Kill Team became when the shape mechanic was introduced. Don't worry, I'm not going to go on a long time about this. I know I've covered it in the past in videos, but let's just use it as an example about an unintuitive core mechanic and how it affects the game. In the new edition of Kill Team, they brought out a system of measurement where you use a shape which is paired with a colour to represent distance. So instead of saying 6 inches, you'd say, I'm going to move red. Or if you're not using colours, maybe you're colourblind, you're going to use pentagon. Now, a pentagon representing 6 inches doesn't make any sense intuitively. If it was a hexagon, That would be an obvious and more intuitive choice, and I think that would have gone a long way to making the system more acceptable. It's the same with the triangle representing 1 inch. Instead, that triangle would have been perfect to represent 3 inches. I often wonder just how popular Kill Team would have been if it was an independent game and it didn't have Games Workshop years of loyal customer fan base behind it. I think if someone came out with that rule and it was as unintuitive as it is, I just don't think it would have been accepted, and I don't think the game would have been successful. So I think they relied a lot on the loyalty of their customers, and the system seems to be more of a gimmick rather than something that's going to enhance gameplay. I must admit though, once I stopped thinking about it as inches and ignored the shapes even and just went with the colours, I did find it worked a lot better. But still, was it really necessary? Okay, let's move on and have a look at balance. And achieving balance in core mechanic, that's an art in itself. Whether it's balancing movement speed with defensive capabilities or ensuring that powerful abilities have corresponding drawbacks, a balanced system is going to foster fairness and it's going to keep the game competitive. Balance is a huge topic, and if you're trying to balance between factions, then that can certainly dominate the conversation, especially where competitive games are concerned. I argue that balance outside of the core mechanics shouldn't take front and centre. Life isn't balanced, and especially in historical gaming with games like Bolt Action, it's interesting, challenging and fun to go into a scenario where the sides aren't properly balanced. When the underdog wins, it creates such a great experience and it really gives the opportunity for some cinematic moments. Of course, a game has to have some element of balance, but no matter how much time you put into trying to balance your game, some hyper-competitive players are always going to try and break it. They're always going to try and build an army or a group or warband that tips the scales in their favour. But for me, that isn't how I want to play games. I want my games to be fun and narrative, and I want to create characters and use models that are going to be fun to play on the tabletop. I don't want to have to go and get miniatures and play them just because they're the best ones and they'll win the games. So that's not how I'm going in the direction I'm taking my games in, and if you're into that style of narrative play, I think you're really going to enjoy Population Z, especially the solo and co-op play mechanics that I've built into the game. Of course, there's nothing wrong with playing games how you want to play them, and if you want to be a proper meta player and get all the best armies all the time so that you can just beat people hands down and you enjoy doing that, and you find other people who want to play that way too, because a lot of people do want to play that way, especially with games like Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar and even Kill Team. So if that's your thing, I hope you have fun with it, but it's just not for me. Actually, thinking about it, if everyone did play the meta, then you would get some form of balance, wouldn't you, in the end result? But it would be pretty boring and it's pretty guided as to what you have to do. I'd rather just make things that I want to play rather than building, painting and playing things that I think I have to play just to win. There we go then. We've looked at Tabletop Skirmish game, core mechanics, and we've defined 4 main elements. Once we've defined our core mechanics, the work really now begins, and this is where the artistic side of things really comes into play. You're going to have to develop a delicate balance of strategy, intuition and clarity when you're designing your games. A well-crafted system is going to encompass movement, combat resolution, abilities, resource management and interaction with the environment, and that's all going to lay the foundation for an immersive and enjoyable gaming experience for the players. For me, Tabletop Skirmish games should be exciting, fun and social times to get together with our friends and families to tell stories around the table and create awesome memories. A solid set of core mechanics helps create these good times, and focusing on these 5 main elements is a great starting point for any game creator. I hope you enjoyed this episode 1 of the new TTSG Solocast, and I hope you found it helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the subject, so join in the conversation in the comments down below. It'd be great to hear what you think, and I always get stuck in and reply to the comments as well, so I do see everything that goes down there. So yeah, it'd be awesome to hear from you. If you like to read blog posts, then head over to my website. I'll put a link down below where you can read all the blog posts that tie in with this new series. So anything I cover here in an episode, you can be assured there'll be a blog post about it too. Look out for my new game, Population Z, Welcome to Huntsville, launching in January 2024. You're going to see a lot more about it over the next few months, so keep an eye out here on YouTube, and also come and join me on Facebook. I've got the Facebook group there and my main Facebook page. I hang out there most of the time, and if you'd like to join, there's links down below. I also post links to my blog post on LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram, but most of the time you'll find me on Facebook or here on YouTube. Thanks again for listening. If you did enjoy it or you got anything from the podcast at all, it'd be brilliant if you hit the like button, subscribe to keep up to date with all the new episodes, and I look forward to seeing you here next time on the TTSG Solocast.